Hey, how's it going? It's Lee Halliday, and in this video, the main thing we're going to cover is how to use or add Autosuggest to React. So we're going to be using the React Autosuggest library for that. And the secondary purpose to this video is basically how to combine React Autosuggest with a Formik form. If you're only interested in Autosuggest, that's fine. That's sort of the first part, and then we'll tie it together with Formik. So to get going, I've got this simple Create React app that has a Formik form. Again, if you don't care about Formik, don't worry, because inside of here, we're just dealing with regular forms and inputs and labels and all that stuff we're used to. So to get started, we've already installed the Autosuggest package, and I've just uncommented this so that we can start using it. So the first thing we're going to do is come into our form, and we're going to be putting this right here after email. And this Autosuggest is basically going to allow the users to search through different countries, and by typing, it's going to pop up all the country names and they can choose the one they're interested in. So we'll start by putting a div, and to make it look a little bit nicer, we'll give it a class name of input row. And inside of this div is where we start to deal with the Autosuggest. But before that, let's actually just add a label first. So we'll say HTML4. It's going to be for an input with an ID of country. So we'll put that, and we'll just put country above here. Okay, so if I were to save this, we'll get the label of country. And now we need to start adding the React Autosuggest. So we type the component Autosuggest. And what you're going to see here, it's a self-closing component. And basically, we have to give it a ton of different props to get this thing to work correctly. And the very first prop that we work with is one called input props. And that is because Autosuggest is what controls the actual input that's displayed to the user. And we can basically pass some props that Autosuggest will pass on to the input element that it is rendering. So what we want are a lot of the standard ones that you deal with when you have inputs. You've got a placeholder, type your country, we'll say. We've got the, I'm using one called autocomplete, and when I was playing around with this, I was having some issues where, see when I go down here, it's popping up all of the suggestions of different emails. I didn't want it to pop up suggestions, and I found by sort of giving it a junk value here in autocomplete, it doesn't try to suggest anything to you. So the next one we've got is name. We're going to be entering country, so we'll put that here. ID of the same thing. And the reason I'm doing ID is basically to link it up to this label here. The HTML4 points down to the ID. So below the ID, we'll get to this later. This is where it starts getting into the specifics of Autosuggest. Okay, so it's complaining, and I don't really know. Okay, well, it has no suggestions, so it's, oh shoot. It's freaking out, it has no suggestions. So let's get into what you have to add in to make Autosuggest actually work. So this is a controlled component, meaning we basically need to have some state that it will show to the user. And there's two pieces of state we need for Autosuggest to work. So we'll come way up here. And, oh, great form. I had two forms I was playing around with, one called average and one called great. But I've changed this to be Formik form, like the file. So anyways, so the state we need to keep track of is A, what is the value as the user types, like say they're spelling Canada, like C-A-N. That all needs to be stored in state because it is a controlled component. So we'll say const, and this will be country and set country. And we're going to be using use state hook from React. And the next state we need to keep track of is an array of the suggestions that the user can choose from. So suggestions and set suggestions. And use state, and we'll start this out as an empty array. So if we save this, it's not going to be working yet because we need to come down here and basically pass this suggestions array into React Autosuggest. So we'll come down here below and we'll say suggestions is equal to oops, this, suggestions. Okay. So it's still busted, and now it cannot read property trim of undefined. So this is, I believe, because I haven't passed in the value to the input prop of the input field that's being displayed. So value will be this country state that I set up that starts out as an empty string. Very nice. Okay, so we've got this field showing up now. Type your country. All is good. It doesn't quite match the styling of these up here, but that doesn't matter. So as I start to type, it's not really doing anything yet. And that's because we need to implement a few other props on input here, and then later some code to actually go out to a server and get a list of countries as the user's typing them. But we're making some progress. Okay, so the next thing we need to add is an OnChange prop, and this will be a handler function to handle the OnChange event. So this will be an arrow function like this. And what does this arrow function receive? The first thing it receives is the event itself. We're not really going to use this, but what we're passed is something called the new value. So every time the user types a letter, whatever the new value is in this input, that's going to be passed to us in this OnChange function event handler here. And then we can decide what to do with this. So because we're controlling the input of this field, it's a controlled component, we need to take this new value and put it into our state. So set country will be equal to the new value. So we now are able to type in here. So we're making some progress. Clear that out. Okay. So we've handled the change of this. Now we need to go and add a few more props to this Autosuggest component. So it's complaining that we need to implement a prop called OnSuggesttions fetch requested. So this is basically the code that, based on whatever the user has entered, it goes out to the internet, like it makes an Axios call, which we'll be doing, and it gets the new suggestions based on the user's input, and it updates our suggestions state. So this is OnSuggesttions fetch requested. Okay. So what this is going to be is an async function. So we'll do that. And what we receive here is basically the value that the user has entered in. And then it's basically what we can do is anything we want to populate the suggestions array. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll just check if this has a value. Because if there's nothing in here, well then we can just set suggestions back to an empty array and just get out of this function because we don't really need to do anything else. And you know what? Why don't we just get rid of all these errors so we can continue without being bugged by this. So we need to implement a prop called OnSuggestion clear requested. This is when the user types something and then they clear it out. What do you want to do when that happens? So we will do a function here, and this function will basically just set suggestions back to an empty array, like that. Okay, get suggestion value. So this is another prop it's telling us we need to define. So what this will do is we need to pass a function to it, and it is going to receive the suggestion, and then we need to, based on this suggestion, return something to display in this field here. So suggestions is going to be an array of objects where each object sort of looks like this, has a name, Canada, and then maybe we have a flag that points to an image we can display along with it. So what we want to do is basically return, so I can actually just shorten this, the suggestion.name, like that. Cool. So the last one we need to implement is render suggestion. And this will also be past the suggestion that needs to be rendered. And what we're going to do is for now, just stick it in a div where we display the suggestion.name. That. So it's not complaining anymore. I can type, it shows up, but it's not doing anything yet. It's not showing all of the suggestions, and that's because we haven't finished implementing the onSuggestions fetch requested. So this is where we need to use Axios to go out to the internet based on the value they've entered and go get the countries to display. So I'm going to uncomment out Axios. Come down here. Where is this code? Here we go. So I'm going to wrap this whole thing in a TryCatch, because if this Axios call fails, I want to handle that. And what I'm just going to do is basically set suggestions to an empty array. If it fails making the Axios request, let's just not display anything. Maybe we want to show an error to the user, but this is good enough for now. So there's a website I found called restcountries.eu, and it returns based on sort of some, if I make this big for a sec, if I pass in sort of some text, so if I do C, it's going to return an array of countries where it matches with C. And some of the data it has is the name. It's got a flag image in here that we can use. So we're going to be using this API. So I'm just going to copy this. Can close that off and make this window small again. So here we got to implement Axios. So remember I made this function async, and that is because we are going to use async await. So we've got result, and we're going to await the Axios call, and it will be axios.get. And into get, we will pass the URL that we're going to fetch the data from. And I've sort of removed where it would say Canada or whatnot, and we need to replace this with whatever the user has entered. So that has come to us here to this function as value. Okay, so we've got that. We're awaiting the result, and this is an Axios result. So Axios result has data. And what we want to do is we're going to pass this data to set suggestions like this. Actually, we could just console.log it now to see what's in it. So result.data. So as I type, you can see that it's returning me an array of data. And as I type Canada, I finally get down to only one where it's Canada here. It starts out at the beginning with 175 options. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass this to set suggestions, but we can't pass it as is. I mean, we could, but we're going to map it to make it a little bit nicer. So we're going to map our data, which is an array of countries. We'll just call this row, like one row or element. Row's fine. So a row represents one country. And what we want to return, so I'll do an implicit return is an object where we have the name property. So this is the row.name. And why don't we get the flag as well? I know there's a flag property on here, so row.flag, like this. So now when I save it, as I start typing, not my name, Canada, you can see now it's doing the autocomplete. The styling's a little bit messed up, but this video is not about styling, so we'll forget about that. So I can type Canada, choose it, and hit enter. And that will choose Canada and place its value in this input field. So there's one prop I haven't implemented yet. And you'll notice that if I refresh the page, if I choose Canada and I hit enter, it's actually submitting the form that it's in. And that's not something we want to do. And what's happening is enter triggers the form that it's in to submit, which is triggering all of the validation and stuff like that. So we don't want to deal with that. So what we're going to do is implement a function called OnSuggest Selected. So this is called anytime you select one of the suggestions that's displayed. And this is a function like this. And the first thing that it receives is the event itself. The next is the suggestion that was chosen and the method. Okay, so what are all those things? Method is how the user chose it. So maybe they hit the down key and they chose it that way. But when I hit enter, that method that we're passed is the enter method. So what we can do is basically say if method is equal to enter. So when that happens, we don't want it to try to submit the form like it's been trying to do. So we can actually just take this event and we can tell it to prevent default. So what is the default that it's preventing? It's preventing the form from being submitted. So as I type Canada and hit enter here, you can see that it's now no longer submitting this form, which is exactly what we wanted. The next thing we could do is basically we can, just to be safe, we can set the country state based on the suggestion. So we'll say suggestion.name to make sure that the one that was selected has been set and it's now in our state. So up until this point, we've basically implemented the Autosuggest. So if that's all you're interested in, you're done. On the Autosuggest website, there's a bunch of CSS that I've copied into sort of the Create React Apps CSS file. So if things are looking a little bit funky, here's where you can come in and tweak the CSS. So this is just all the standard stuff that comes with it. But we're going to leave that alone and we're going to hook it up to Formik now. So there's a couple things we need to do to hook this up to Formik. The first thing we need to do is right up here to Formik, we need to add a new additional initial value. So this will be country and we'll start it off as nothing. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to start validating this field. So we'll come up here to our yup validation schema and we'll add in a new one for country. So why don't we just say here that this is a required field? That's it. Must choose country. Like that. So now we'll be validating the country input. So on our other fields that I've done in Formik, I've conditionally added a class name to each of the input fields that basically adds a red border around it if there's an error. So what we can do is come and add that to our input props here. So we'll say class name is equal to country. So if the country's been touched, if the user's sort of changed it in any way, and there's an error for country, we'll add the class has error. Cool. I guess Autosuggest adds its own class by default, so me overriding this now gives it the same styling as all the other forms. So that's nice. It still works, and it looks a little bit better now. Well, better or worse, depending what you think, but so that's working here. The next thing that I've done in Formik is I've been using this error component that basically looks at if it's been touched and there's an error message, display that message below. So we're going to add this below here and we'll just update these to look at country. So it's not really hooked together yet, like it's sitting inside of Formik, but Formik is not yet aware of the value that you've chosen. For example, if I fill this out, email at email.com, I choose a country and then I submit, you see that it doesn't think I chose a country yet. And that's because we've been controlling the value and storing it in our own state, way up here at the top in here. But we haven't really made Formik aware of this value. So there is a function that Formik gives you, and it's basically for whenever you have to bypass the normal value like handling via OnChange in Formik, and you need to handle setting its value yourself. It gives you a function called setFieldValue. And this function, we can come and we can call it, and we get to decide when we call it, I guess, but when I am going to set this now is when a suggestion has been selected. So basically, as I'm typing, Formik's not yet aware, so if I were to submit, it still says you must choose one. And I want it to be set once I choose one from Autosuggest. So I'll come down here in the OnSuggest Selected Prop function, and I will call setFieldValue. So I'm going to be setting the country field, and it is going to have suggestion.name, like this. So now, if I type and choose Canada, so now Formik's been made aware of it by calling this setFieldValue. If I just fill in this, email@email.com, and I submit the form, now you can see that it knows about the country that I've chosen in React Autosuggest. So the very last thing, and this is just for fun, is I was setting the flag, and in this render suggestion, if we wanted to, here's where we could sort of add in, it's a little bit hard to read, let's just make it. So we could add in an image tag, and we could set the source, and the source could be suggestion.flag, and it's probably gonna look horrible. It wants an alt field, so we'll give it that. Cool. So just to line things up again, now when I type Canada, oh yeah, nothing better. All right, let's just set the width to, what, 25 pixels here? Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So there we go, we're using the flag and we're customizing how Autosuggest renders each one. On suggestion selection, we're passing its value up to Formik so that it can do all the validation on it, and its value will be made available when we submit the form through Formik. So in this video, what we covered is basically what are the 400 props you have to pass to the Autosuggest component to make it work. You need to pass a prop to handle what's passed down to the input element that it's rendering. We needed to pass the current suggestions that it wants to display. We had to pass a function which handles going and making an Axios request to get the countries so we can populate our suggestion state. We had to handle what to do when the user wants to clear out the suggestions. Maybe they hit, I think escape will do that too. That will clear that out. I was hitting the escape key. Obviously you can't see that, but we handled what to do when the user selects one of the suggestions, and we handled some prevent default when they selected via enter so that it doesn't actually try to submit the underlying form that it's been placed inside. We handled how to get the suggestion value. So in each suggestion, it was an object, and we're going and we're grabbing the suggestion name so that it knows what to display in this input here. And we also customized how each of them is rendered so that we could display an image beside the name of each country. So then we hooked it up to Formik, and we did that by basically using this setFieldValue function that Formik comes with that allows us to implicitly set the values that it's keeping track of inside of its values state. And that's how you use Autosuggest and how you link it up to Formik. I hope you enjoyed this video. Take care. Bye.